السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعله الكتاب الأول الذي يسرد قصة كل معتقل في سجن أمريكا غير الشرعي، معتقل غوانتانامو. تعذيب وإهانات وإضراب عن الطعام. معتقل غوانتانامو وملفاتهم ومعاناتهم وقضية سجنهم من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. هو المعتقل السيء السمعة الذي بدأت السلطات الأمريكية باستعماله عام 2002 لسجن من تشتبه في كونهم بين مزدوجين إرهابيين، هو معتقل غوانتانامو الذي يعد سلطة مطلقة لوجوده خارج الحدود الأمريكية، ولا ينطبق عليه أي من قوانين حقوق الإنسان، إلى الحد الذي جعل منظمة العفو الدولية تقول إن معتقل غوانتانامو الأمريكي يمثل همجية هذا العصر. ويرى المراقبون أن معتقل غوانتانامو تنمحي فيه جميع القيم الإنسانية وتنعدم فيه الأخلاق، ويعامل فيه المعتقلون بقساوة شديدة، مما أدى إلى احتجاج بعض المنظمات الحقوقية الدولية والمطالبة بوضع حد لهذه المعاناة وإغلاق المعتقل إغلاقا تاما. في 30 من نيسان أبريل عام 2013 جدد الرئيس الأمريكي باراك أوباما نيته إغلاق المعتقل بعدما عبر عن ذلك خلال سباقه الرئاسي في 2008. وفي الأول من أيار مايو عام 2013 صدر تصريح عن البيت الأبيض يقول إنه يدرس تعيين دبلوماسي رفيع للعمل من أجل إرسال المعتقلين في غوانتانامو إلى أوطانهم أو إلى بلدان ثالثة. وفي خطابه في كانون الثاني يناير 2014 ناشد أوباما أعضاء الكونغرس الذي أحبط محاولاته السابقة لإغلاق المعتقل، ناشدهم رفع كل القيود أمام نقل المعتقلين. أندي ورثينغتون المؤرخ البريطاني والصحفي الاستقصائي ومؤلف كتاب ملفات غوانتانامو، قصص 774 معتقلا في سجن أمريكا غير القانوني، يتحدث عن كيفية جمعه المعلومات عن المعتقلين وسجنهم، وكيف تجري معاملتهم هناك، وما هي أسباب اعتقالهم بدون محاكمات، في أول كتاب يروي قصة كل معتقل في غوانتانامو من الداخل. Andy Worthington, London-based historian, investigative journalist and author of the Guantanamo Files, the stories of the 774 detainees in America's illegal prison, and it is the first book to tell the story of every man trapped in Guantanamo. Welcome to the Inside, sir.
Thank you.
To start, sir, what made you go to this direction of trying to divulge the story behind Guantanamo? And according to Michelle Shepard, author of Guantanamo's Child, when summing up other books on Guantanamo, she described your book as perhaps the single most important book to cover the big picture of Guantanamo.
Well, you know, I began by, from a human rights perspective, of being pretty shocked and appalled by what the Americans were doing at Guantanamo. Clearly, you know, something terrible happened on September 11th, 2001, but when Guantanamo opened, it became clear that something terrible was happening as America's response to it, because here we had these guys in the orange jumpsuits with sensory deprivation, essentially. They had their ears covered, they had their eyes covered. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure we all remember that photo where they're kneeling on the ground with the soldiers shouting at them and they're all shackled. Mm-hmm. That didn't look normal to anybody, perhaps outside of America, where they're used to seeing prisoners wearing orange. But you know, it took a long time really for any of us to get any information out of Guantanamo. For the first few years it was almost completely sealed shut.
How did you start?
Well, I began trying to find out who was there in 2005. Mm-hmm. And you know, the Americans at that point hadn't even been compelled to release the names and nationalities of the prisoners. Nobody even really knew who was there. Mm-hmm. But I went through accounts from the media, I went through interviews with released prisoners. I tried to piece together what was happening, and then in the spring of 2006 That's when the US government lost a lawsuit brought by media organizations compelling them to release information, the names and nationalities of the prisoners, 8,000 pages of documents about the allegations against the men, and the transcripts of their tribunals at Guantanamo. This had been a very unfair process, but the US military had allowed the men to talk about what the charges against them were. And as a result of all of this information being released, I then spent a year going through it, working out who was who and writing the book. I always thought that somebody else must be doing it, and I was thinking particularly of major American newspapers. But it turned out that nobody else had gone through all this information to try and work out who everybody was, where they were caught, what their stories were. And that was the basis of the book. And ever since, I've carried on writing about Guantanamo.
But how were you able, sir, to trace the stories of 774 detainees in Guantanamo, and you've never been there?
Well, you know, I did it mostly through what was made publicly available by the Pentagon. The process that's...
Did you have any sort of classified information, perhaps, or
no,
something like that
what I tried to do was to understand the context of where people were and what they were doing. So, you know, people were captured in Afghanistan. Many people were captured going from Afghanistan into Pakistan. Many people were captured in Pakistan, hadn't been in Afghanistan at all. A smaller number of people were captured in various places around the world and subjected to extraordinary rendition. Some of these people were held in CIA black sites. What I did really was to ask, if I found that people were captured in a certain place and they were telling a certain story, was for me to say, does this sound plausible? So, you know, there were dozens and dozens of people who were captured in house raids in Pakistan by the Pakistani police or intelligence services, sometimes with the Americans. These people said they were teachers, they said they were working for various charitable organizations. I had to evaluate, is this a plausible story or not? And quite often it seemed to me that these people were telling the truth, but the position that the United States took was that everybody that had ended up in their custody, however they had ended up in their custody, these were enemy combatants, they were guilty, the President said that was the case, nobody needed to bother investigating what the actual evidence was, which is shocking. So that's what I did, was to analyze the information.
It's an analysis of what happened to the detainees there in Guantanamo, and also based on certain stories from the people who were released. How many people were released so far?
Well, over 600 of the men that were held at Guantanamo have been released.
So we still have like 174?
There are 164 men still
164?
there. Yeah.
Okay. So, what about their conditions so far?
Well, you know, the terrible thing is that President Obama came into office in January 2009 and he promised to close Guantanamo within a year, and he clearly did not succeed in that mission. What he did do in his first and second year in office was that he released around 70 of the prisoners. But in the last 3 years, almost no one has been released from Guantanamo. And there are two main reasons for that, really. One is that Congress, lawmakers in Congress, imposed very severe obstacles to prevent the release of prisoners for reasons that are either completely cynical or that suggest that these people are kind of terrified of terrorism 24 hours a day. But they imposed restrictions to try and stop the president from releasing anybody from Guantanamo. They said that the Secretary of Defense would have to certify that these people are not able to engage in terrorism after they've been released. They said, you know, we don't want anyone being released if there's a single claim that a person from that country has ever engaged in terrorism after their release. The president has the power to override Congress, but he's been unwilling to spend the political capital to do that.
We will come back and talk about Obama and his stance concerning the closing of the Guantanamo Bay detention center, as he has promised at the beginning of his tenure. But allow me here to ask, who are the prisoners or the detainees who are still kept incarcerated in Guantanamo?
Well, a very small number of those men who are still held, and I would say that it's less than 20, are people where there are allegations that these people were involved in acts of international terrorism, that they were involved with Al-Qaeda. There are a handful of senior Taliban figures as well. You know, these are the only people against whom the United States has any kind of case regarding terrorism. So the rest of the people who are there are either completely innocent people who were picked up because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the United States doesn't believe that.
But why are they still holding them?
Well, when the United States set up Guantanamo under President Bush, they broke all the established rules about how you detain people. If you're going to deprive somebody of their liberty, you're either they're either a criminal, that you accuse them of crimes, and then you put them on trial in a court, or they're people that you take off the battlefield in wartime. In which case, you know, when the war is over, these people are released. But the Bush administration said these people are not in either of those categories. These people are enemy combatants. They literally said these people have no rights whatsoever. And over the years, lawyers have fought for them to have the right to challenge the basis of their detention. But there's no automatic mechanism whereby anyone can decide that the time has come for these men to be released. They can literally be held forever, according to the laws that were passed to justify this terrible innovation that the Bush administration embarked on. So that's why.
Now those people held illegally without charge or trial, as you said, are not able to speak to the outside world. Who speaks for them?
Well, the only people who can speak for them are their lawyers.
What about their families? No connection with them whatsoever?
Well, yeah, I mean, they are, since President Obama got into office, they are now allowed every now and then to talk to their families on the phone. They're not allowed any family visits. I think it's very important to remember that, you know, that every criminal on the US mainland, whatever they were convicted of, can be visited by their family, whereas the prisoners in Guantanamo are not allowed family visits. Even, you know, if their families were able to get the money together to fly out to Guantanamo, they're absolutely not allowed to. So the only connection they have with their families is through these occasional phone calls. Sometimes the families will report on what's happened, but mainly it's through the lawyers. And the reason for that it's coming through the lawyers is that there's a very specific process that the lawyers have to go through. Every time they go to Guantanamo and meet their clients, they write down the notes, handwritten notes of what they discuss. Every single word of that is classified by the United States government until the notes are submitted to a censorship team in the Pentagon, and they decide whether any of that information can be publicly released. If they say that that information can be publicly released, then the lawyers are able to say to the world, you know, I went and met my client 6 months ago, and this is what he told me about what's happening to him, what's happening in Guantanamo. And most of what we know about what's actually happening in there is through the stories that the lawyers are able to tell.
Well, Andy, we're going to stop now for a short break, and then when we come back we'll talk a bit further about the circumstances of inside Guantanamo, from the stories of the released people from Guantanamo. من الداخل سيعود بعد قليل، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
الصحفي الاستقصائي البريطاني أندي ورثينغتون ماذا يكشف عن ظروف المعتقلين داخل سجن غوانتانامو في كتابه وسط المطالبة العالمية الملحة بإغلاق هذا المعتقل.
Well, I hope it's managed to tell the story of what the conditions were like. I mean, a lot of what I wrote about was about the early years in Guantanamo, when terrible things were happening in terms of the way that prisoners were treated. Torture techniques were used in the prison. You know, most of that came to an end in 2004 when the prisoners won a case in the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said these men have habeas corpus rights. That was when the lawyers first were able to visit. And that did change the behavior of the authorities. But the entire prison it's a form of torture to be holding these people indefinitely when they have no idea of when, if ever, they're going to be released. So although, you know, the worst days are over, you know, the whole place remains a problem. And I was trying to convey that, not just who these people were, but how was Guantanamo operating, what were the things that happened there. And, you know, the greatest accolade that I've ever been given about my work came from a former prisoner, Omar Dagayes, who was born in Libya but is a British resident, long-term British resident. And he said to me, Andy, your book is as though you were there with us. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could be told anything
something like that.
That great from any other source.
What does the British government actually do concerning some people who are British citizens held at Guantanamo? Like, for example, Shakir Amir, who is on hunger strike after being detained by US for 11 years, and he tells and speaks of brutal daily cell searches. And according to The Independent, last August, the last British resident in Guantanamo Bay claims he is being assaulted, sometimes sexually, during prison searches as he continues a hunger strike against his unlawful detention.
Well, you know, it's disgusting that Shakir Amir is still held in Guantanamo because, you know, in the early days when Guantanamo opened, foreign governments, whatever they may have said, didn't really care that much. It took, you know, a process of years.
But you know, Cameron is a friend of Obama, at least.
Yeah, well, you know, what happened was that a few years into the horrible Guantanamo experiment, the European government said it's time for us to get our nationals back. So they did that. Now, Britain had a number of residents in the prison, and Tony Blair wasn't interested. When Gordon Brown became the Prime Minister in 2007, one of the first things he did was say, we want our residents back. And all of those people were released, apart from Shakir Amir. He's the only one who's still held. Like you say, you know, Cameron knows Obama. There is a special relationship between Britain and the United States. If Britain really wanted Shakir Amir back, he would be here. But Shakir Amir, from the beginning, was somebody who stood up for the rights of the prisoners. You know, he's really fought back against the United States. And as a result of that, they've treated him appallingly over the years. But they regard him as a threat in the sense, not, I think, of anything that he's supposed to have done, because he was cleared for release under President Bush and has been cleared for release under President Obama, but is still held. It's because of what he knows about the entire operation of Guantanamo and the war on terror, and what he will talk about when he is released. And I think that's why they continue to hold him.
So, I mean, as a means of shutting him up, they just shut him behind the bars in Guantanamo.
Yeah.
Now, at least 2 Guantanamo Bay detainees have attempted suicide since the confrontation between guards and prisoners last February that brought about this hunger strike, according to the Associated Press. And commenting on this issue, Lieutenant Commander Kelvin Bogocci, a U.S. Navy military lawyer who has visited his clients at the base, he told the Associated Press, quote, "How can the military, even the military, hope to maintain discipline over a prison camp where there is absolutely no hope for those men confined here?"
Well, that is what happened in February. Is that the men were upset because there had been very intrusive searches of their cells implemented, in which they felt that the personnel at Guantanamo were manhandling their copies of the Quran. And that's when they started a hunger strike. But what was beneath that was this long-term despair. These are men who were hopeful when President Obama came in, and have seen their hopes dashed. So not only do you have 84 of the 164 men who are held, who have been cleared for release by a task force, a government task force that President Obama established. These men are stuck there, year after year. The US said to them in January 2010, "We've reviewed your cases, we don't want to carry on holding you," but they're still stuck there. Of course they're in despair, but actually for most of the other prisoners as well, they're not getting any justice. They never see that justice is going to arrive, that they're going to be put on trial, or that anything is going to happen for them to be released. So the entire prison is full of people in despair, essentially, and that's what happened with the hunger strike. It really took off. It involved a majority of the prisoners, and I'm very glad to say that it awakened the world's media to what was happening in Guantanamo, because most of the mainstream media was not reporting it.
To what extent has torture become the national policy? This extraordinary rendition and all those means has become the national policy of certain governments.
Well, I'm sure that, you know, we know what has happened is that around the world, when countries are flouting human rights, some of them will deliberately quote what America has been doing for the last 12 years. You know, so that's really not a good thing. But it's a bad thing for America. It permanently undermines any attempt by America to hold the moral high ground on anything, because they have this prison open at Guantanamo. They have these men being held indefinitely who,
But the justification is always that those people are terrorists and we need to keep them held there.
If they're terrorists, then, you know, terrorism is a crime. What happens with that is that you prosecute them and you give them a trial. You know, a jury will find people guilty if the evidence is presented to justify your claims. Otherwise, you know, by all means hold these men as prisoners of war, and then let's start discussing how long your war actually lasts. You know, the United States is withdrawing the majority of its troops, I think, from Afghanistan next year. That is going to lead to legal challenges, because most of the men in Guantanamo are held in connection with the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. They were actually seized at the time of the invasion or afterwards in connection with that. The rationale for holding them, I think, is going to disappear, such as it is. I don't think there's ever been a sound rationale for holding these men without rights. There absolutely isn't.
Right.
But there will be challenges next year. You know, the United States has to give up on pretending that the rules that existed before 9/11 were inadequate for depriving people of their liberty. We have the ways to do that. And Guantanamo remains a symbol and an icon of the lawlessness that the Bush administration embarked upon, in its arrogance and its disregard for the correct ways of treating people.
Right, and now detaining people is something, but torturing them is another, actually. And according to the Open Society Justice Initiative, the OSJI, a New York-based human rights organization, it said, quote, "Indeed, numerous professional U.S. interrogators have confirmed that torture does not produce reliable intelligence, and that rapport-building techniques are far more effective at eliciting such kind of intelligence. Then why did they resort to torture?"
Well, they didn't want to listen to their own experts who told them rapport building is the only way to do it. You know, for whatever reasons, I believe they were driven by vengeance, actually, and they wanted to punish the people who were responsible for what had happened to them, and they decided that one way of doing that would be to torture people, that would be the way they would get the information. They ignored everyone who told them that wasn't the case. The sad thing is that although I think that the United States now has pretty much stopped engaging in that, as far as we know, there is no longer a network of black sites and this extraordinary rendition, kidnapping people and sending them all around the world, which the Bush administration did. What President Obama did by very specifically coming into office and saying, we're looking forward and not backwards, what he meant by that was we're not going to have accountability for those senior officials in the Bush administration, up to and including President Bush, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, but all the lawyers as well who provided them with their phony justifications for torturing, like John Yoo, the Justice Department lawyer, who said torture isn't torture. How we understand it isn't, and was giving approval for it all to happen. President Obama has refused to allow any of these people to be held accountable. The message that sends to the world and to Americans is that the absolute prohibition on torture is no longer an absolute prohibition on torture. It allows the virus of torture to enter into the consciousness of American society that actually, you know, there are times when it's necessary. And we all worked, everybody worked very hard, particularly after the Second World War, until the ratification of the United Nations Convention Against Torture in 1987, to say let us try and be civilized. Let us try and rise above this, and collectively let's ban, absolutely ban the use of torture. And while these people still walk free, you know, torture has infected America, and that then spreads out to the rest of the world. And it's important, I believe, that one day these people must be held accountable for what they did.
Right. Allow me to ask one last question, but quickly, if I may ask, whose story, Detainee, whose story captured your attention the most and affected you?
There are loads of stories, really. I mean, perhaps it's Omar Khadr, the Canadian boy who was 15 when he was shot in the back in a firefight in Afghanistan, and the United States claimed that he had thrown a grenade that killed a US soldier. But, you know, he was a child. Under the UN treaty that is supposed to protect children in armed conflict, which the US signed, and Canada signed, they're supposed to rehabilitate this boy rather than punish him, but they punished him, and Canada is still punishing him. He was treated appallingly. They tortured him, they abused him. Not once did they ever give him his rights as a child and understand that whatever he was doing in Afghanistan, he had been sent there by his father. But also, you know, they then made him sign a plea deal in one of their trials at Guantanamo, in which he said that he was entirely responsible for what he did. You know, he was captured in wartime, but they made it a war crime for him to have been involved in this activity, and he was a child. It doesn't really get any worse than that.
Right. Andy Worthington, London-based historian, investigative journalist, and author of the Guantanamo Files. Many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة، ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل، من كل الميادين من لندن. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.